The risk of cyber security threat on infrastructure is real, and that's something that's really hard to kind of stay on top of from my point of view. And then there's other things like supply chain risk, and I don't think we've got to a point where we've realised the outcome and the risks attached to that. And so I think that from a global point of view, there is a lot more risk that we're going to feel, a lot more impact we're going to feel from supply chain risk, particularly if we're using global suppliers. And then it's about how do we manage and stay on top of all of these emerging and escalating risks, as well as looking at our Larry's just joined us. Hey, how you going, mate?
Hey, Larry. How you going, mate?
And so...
And hi, Daniel, too. Sorry, we saw you pop up there. Yep.
How do we continue to manage all of our business as usual risks? So all of those things that we need to manage on a day-to-day basis, is there a chance that they're going to get away from us or go unchecked as we're focusing on our sort of post-COVID environment, what we're managing at the moment? So things like internal fraud, for example, is that going to get away from us if we kind of loosened our sign-offs with people working from home? Do we have oversight of all of these sorts of things? So it's a real juggling act right now in terms of what's emerging and what's escalating, as well as all the BAU that we manage on a day-to-day basis. And so when James and I talked about it, as we have done a fair bit, that's, I guess, what keeps us awake at night.
And I think, look, I'll post it in the chat and also attach it to the briefing from today. But I think for those that might have missed it, there was a great article in the AFR on the weekend that was likening this supply chain risk at the moment a little bit like trying to shake out a tomato sauce bottle. So, an upside down sauce bottle that's all caught in the neck. And so I think from what we're seeing, and unfortunately, the risk universe hasn't shrunk at all, it's grown bigger. So we've got all the normal BAU risk, plus we've got all this peripheral additional emergent stuff that I think we wouldn't have necessarily anticipated. And, for most of us, we've been sitting here and talking about this sort of stuff for well over 12 months now. So you think about where we were March last year. I think it was like Ron and I sitting in a caravan on my front driveway talking on Zoom as we're all talking from living rooms and garages and all that sort of stuff.
Mindful risk. We're a sophisticated operation.
Yeah. That's right. And so we fast forward to where we are now. And look, fingers crossed we've come over the first sort of major hump. But then there's all this additional kind of, let's call it emergent risk that's popped out. And so we thought that'd be a great segue to hearing from some of our members and community people today about what's going on in their sectors. So without further ado, I'll launch over into Kath, because we've got limited time. We don't want to waste anyone's time. And I know Kath's got to go as well. So Kath, from your perspective, and for those that may not be familiar with Kath, Kath is a senior WHS manager in the rail sector in New South Wales, but a nationally based business. And I think, Kath, your turf includes South Australia as well, is that correct?
WA, SA, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland.
Yeah, so the whole lot. And so I guess, Kath, we posed these questions to you prior to the session. Could you talk us through, what are the emergent risks that are keeping you awake at night relevant to the rail sector?
So it's interesting you talk about supply. We've, and again, Chatham House rules here, but, we've actually had a fairly profitable sector, even within COVID. When we talk about Australia's supply chain, we literally have been keeping Australia moving and keeping toilet roll on shelves, as we keep telling our people we're responsible for doing that. So in some ways, that's actually been a very good news story. I think from now, it's that ongoing effect of COVID, that kind of, people who get it, apparently some people have that long COVID. I think now we're in that long COVID time. And I guess for me, by that means we've still got teams who are isolating. So we still have various sectors of our business that we have kept isolated. And for them, they're not getting that senior management visibility. They're not having, I would always go, as a safety person, go and pop in and say hello. Still not allowed into those buildings. We seem to be lacking that informal interaction, that water cooler conversation that, and still people aren't fully back into work. So I think there's definitely seen a decrease in the employee engagement scores that we've just had. That, I guess, is concerning going forward, how we sort of come out of that. I think the other one is that remote working. We've already said we start from that position of trust, first and foremost, when it comes to that. But we have had some people leave the organisation, having obviously that trust being lost. So it's interesting that we're now sort of going into that sort of sector. And I guess from a COVID point of view, the last one is that mental health and well-being. A friend of mine who's a clinical psychologist posted an interesting post on LinkedIn about a week ago. She's in the UK, and obviously the UK are coming out of lockdown. Now, for some people, lockdown, especially with those who have got anxiety, has actually been a very good thing, because they've been able to sort of shelter in their houses and not really have that interaction that actually causes them that anxiety. And now they're being, obviously lockdown coming to an end, being pushed to have to socialise again, and that is obviously creating that anxiety as well for people. So I still think we're still sort of starting to see that as we've gone out of lockdown, back into lockdown, and you only have to look at Victoria today. I haven't caught up the news yet this lunchtime, but we're constantly in this phase of bouncing up and down between various stages of restrictions. And for some people, they manage that change very easily, and I think some people don't. And some of our teams have definitely struggled with that mental health. What are we doing about that? So we kicked off some resilience sessions last year, starting in Victoria when it was really bad down there, but we've pretty much gone global with those now. And we've just launched trainer sessions for the next session of resilience. So that was really good. The other thing we've done before COVID, which has worked quite well, is I trained 2 of my team to be mental health first aid instructors with St John's Ambulance, and that's been received really well. So we've tried to get 2 or 3 people within each team trained as mental health first aiders. So I think the first step is to do the resilience training. The second step is to have the first aiders in there to recognise symptoms within the team as well. The first step, obviously, recognise symptoms within yourself if you can do that.
Yeah.
And then the last one that we did was a safety leadership training, which was aimed at that sort of stratum 4, stratum 5 type workers, but really around understanding the psychosocial factors that you've got within the workplaces and trying to recognise those within your teams and do something about them. So almost sort of 3-tiered level at trying to attack those mental health issues.
Okay, and then from a I guess what we've asked, the final question is, in terms of from where you sit as as an industry, who do you think's at risk in terms of, I think for the mining and rail type guys, I'd be looking for your perspective on, which one of your suppliers is at risk? Is there a particular, specialised service that you need to use that you think is more threatened by what we're seeing at the moment?
No, do you know what? I think this, from the mental health perspective, I think it can be across the board. I don't think there's anybody that's left or potentially untouched. I read an interesting article in The Age the other day that said, and look, I'm probably one of these 174,000 people that they actually highlighted, expats who are actually looking to leave Australia because they're sick of the borders being shut and being separated from their families. I always thought Australia was going to be my home for good. I'm actually second guessing myself right now because, having been separated from my family for the 15 months in the UK, with no sign of the borders being open, I'm starting to struggle with that from a mental health perspective. So I'm sure, all levels of management and all the way down to the bottom and all organisations, people are struggling with, and you don't even have to have relatives overseas. It could just be in WA. I know people who haven't seen their families for a year across the States with COVID, and they're struggling with the constant shutting of borders. So I think we need to recognise as organisations that that's taken its toll on our people. And there's nothing we can actually do about that other than support them with it. But it's definitely something that's niggling away in the background for people.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Thanks, Kath. And I think some great comments there from Larry as well. So yeah, totally agree. Please jump on the chat and fire away. But I think, look, at the end of the day, as business people, there's that time value associated with money. And for us, I think a lot of it comes down to interruption to supply chains or to service delivery costs. Yeah. Gary Ash at the end of the day. So, I think that's when it gets really real for people and for businesses. So, Kath, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I'll move over to Dan now. So, Dan, for those that may not be familiar, and sorry, we've lost Olivia. She was messaging me. But I've got Dan, who's a senior manager for Rapsy Griffiths Insolvency and Turnaround. Did I get the term right, Dan?
That's it. That's the one.
And sorry, I've gone blank of your colleague you've got with you.
Casey Hammond. Casey's a fellow manager with me here at Rapsy Griffiths.
Yeah, no, I knew your face was very familiar from when we did the project with you guys a few years ago. So yeah, hey, Casey, how you going? And obviously Olivia's trying to join us, but I think she's having some computer issues. But anyway, so Dan, same questions to you, mate. And thanks, Kath. They were great responses. Same questions to you, mate. What are the risk issues that are keeping you guys awake at night as insolvency practitioners?
Sure. So I guess everyone's probably sick of. I'm going to jump on the COVID bandwagon as well. Initially, I guess everyone shared the same sort of struggles, financial, logistical, those sort of things. But I think what Roman mentioned before about the emerging risks, I guess, are things that we hadn't necessarily turned our mind to, just given the situation at the time and sort of where we've come from to where we are now. But it's interesting seeing the medium-term risk starting to really manifest and sort of the long-term ones start to emerge as well. But the insolvency industry, it may seem a bit counterintuitive, but we are absolutely dead quiet. I think that when COVID was first, the effects started to be felt in Australia, the government jumped on pretty quickly, reducing the likelihood of the age-old certainty of death and taxes. There was a lot of stimulus that was pumped into the economy to boost it, cash flow boost your job keepers, job seekers, and then at a state level as well with other initiatives. I know insolvency practitioners, there's a lot of misconception in the market. We're often called the corporate undertakers or harbingers of death for companies. We're trying to change that image. So think of us as doctors, I guess, for the business. But
much better too.
Yeah, look, I think so. It's got a better marketing spin as well. But I guess, as I touched on before, COVID actually had a really bad impact on the insolvency industry. It probably shows the government measures were effective for the broader economic cycle. But I guess if I can throw some stats at you, in the 6 months ending December 2020, there were 3,000 company insolvency appointments in Australia. That's in comparison to 6,000 the same period in the year prior.
So you say that it broke up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. So in the 6 months to December 2020, there were 3,000 insolvency appointments in Australia in the corporate space. In the 12 months period, in the 12 months prior, so July 2019 to December 2019, there were 6,000. So 50% reduction, and it virtually turned off overnight. I guess what we see as a risk is with the support measures being wound back. I guess it's a matter of time before the normal economic cycle kicks back in. We think that there's the businesses that were, I guess, destined to fail pre-COVID that have been artificially propped up by all the government stimulus. They're destined to fail. It's a matter of time. And then we see there's the businesses that may have had a good business that were adversely impacted by the major lockdowns and the subsequent, the snap lockdowns as well. And those businesses, you're going to have people that will slog it out for a few years. But ultimately, it may get too hard and the long-term effects will manifest. There's obviously the good news stories that we've just heard, such as from Kath at the end of the day about the good news stories where people have come out really well the other side, and it's good to hear those good news stories. But on a day-to-day, that's not the what the insolvency practitioners generally hear about. But I guess for us as a firm, the things that we've seen that have really become apparent are challenges we never thought of previously. I guess the last 8 years, we've been going from growth to growth. It's always busy in the insolvency industry, and then that turned off overnight. So staffing was a really, really big one. I guess year on growth, growing team, and then a reduction in work. I guess that then turned into across Australia, and well, specifically with us, initially we reduced hours to preserve work. And then when people couldn't be meaningfully engaged, unfortunately, that meant a workforce reduction. And then now what's leading to is, I guess, existing engagement with the workforce that remains to make sure that people remain utilised, engaged in the system. And I guess the problem is going to be, now that there's a reduction, how do we scale back up and get the talent when we need it, which is likely as we move towards the second half of the year. It's a pretty niche market. It's hard to find the right people at the right time, but I guess it's about how we can adapt to that process. So staffing was one of the main things. To sort of steal a point that Kath mentioned before as well, I guess the mental health aspects that come with that, not having a workforce that may be, concerned about their jobs, as everyone probably is. And the mental health impacts that has. I guess the second aspect that I wanted to touch on is regulatory reform. Everyone, no matter what industry, always regulatory reform is a key risk area, making sure we're across all the changes. Insolvency has been hammered in the last few years by change. And whether or not that everyone's aware, there were recent reforms announced last year that gave the industry 1 week of consultations, which the government pegged as the biggest changes to the insolvency system in 30 years. What that system involves is a move from a creditor-led model, which is like your normal liquidations and administrations, where creditors guide the process and have a lot of control and oversight, into a debtor-led one, which is modelled based off the US Chapter 11 system, where the business owner retains control of the business and tries to put a restructuring plan to their creditors. I guess big changes, a very small consultation period, and then the legislation has been released. It's in effect, and it is fraught with issue. There's been very, very little uptake. I think my last look, the reforms came into effect on the 1st of January this year. I think there's been 10 appointments on the new type, so very, very little uptake. And it's pegged that there's going to be more reform to fix those issues, and then otherwise a root and branch review of the insolvency system. So wow. We're in for more of an onslaught of regulatory reform. So I guess they're the key sort of risks that we're seeing, that we've seen sort of emerge throughout the last sort of 12 months.
And I mean, yeah, and as you touched on, Dan, I'm sure any of us that either work in or around insolvency professionals, as we do quite regularly, that's, God, we worked with you guys on a risk register. That didn't even enter the sphere, did it? Like
definitely didn't. So
getting your 50% reduction in appointments, that's, nothing you could have ever conceived or, anticipated. So, no, thank you. And so in terms of, just lastly, because we'll just move on and, that's some great insight. Thoughts on, again, appreciate that numbers are down, but thoughts on the industries that you guys think are most at risk coming into the back half of the 2021 calendar year?
I guess the industries we see, retail. There's obviously a lot of reform during COVID around the retail leases, the code of practice. But ultimately, there will be issues in the retail sector. Obviously, retail's been a struggling industry for some years. COVID definitely hasn't helped that, particularly with the growth of online operators as well, which will lead to further issues down the track. The ones that are mainly probably affected, we see, are your smaller type operators or your boutiques in your large shopping centres like your Westfields and your Charter Halls and that sort of thing, just because the rents are so significant, their fixed costs are high, and then there's such reduced foot traffic. And it'll take a while for that to really take effect as the lease code runs out. Tourism, probably another one. There's been obviously a lot in the media, particularly for Queensland and the impact of tourism and the migration as well, and international travel. And then finally, hospitality and accommodation. A lot of the smaller operators, your cafes, your hotels that are really impacted by things like these snap lockdowns. People are ordering out, people aren't wanting to go out. We've seen obviously an increase anecdotally and personally of people getting out and about as things have opened back up. But I still think there's a bit of reservation, and we just have to take a look at Victoria and what's sort of happened in a very short amount of time, and its restrictions ramping up, and unfortunately it's those smaller operators that feel the brunt of that.
Yeah. No, that's great. Look, yeah, that was fantastic, Dan, and yeah, I guess
very insightful.
Yeah, so insightful, especially because so many of us probably sit there, particularly probably our friends in the legal profession, and kind of I think would be envious of the work volumes that get thrown at you guys in insolvency sometimes. But it's not anything that we want to laugh about, but it's certainly I'm hopeful that there's a great way that the way that you guys can do is adapt to that new model and remain agile, as I said. So thank you so much, guys. Thanks for doing this.
Can I just ask you a question,
Sure.
Daniel?
Sure.
Have you seen any growth in businesses in particular borrowing more money to get through these times?
At this stage, it's not something that we're seeing. I guess a lot of the times, if people have access to borrow funds, either whether that's through like personally or through their business, we typically don't see it. It's the effects of once they do that and then things struggle down the track that we see that. We saw a lot of that. I guess I started in the insolvency industry sort of just on the other side, coming out of the GFC, and there was a lot of that, a lot of refinancing. It'll be interesting to see as time goes on. Obviously, really low interest rate environment can get a good deal, but I think the RBA said that interest rates will be on hold until 2024. But I guess that'll be the longer term impact that we see out of that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of talk about economies being run very hot at the moment, well, globally, in terms of stimulus, money's cheap. You've got property. You look at anywhere, you've got property booms going on. It all seems very interesting and complex. But look, Dave, we'll come back to you and we'll move on to John. But thanks again, Dan, Casey, and Olivia. I really appreciate your responses and your insight. Much appreciated. All right, Jono, over to you, mate. So again, for those that don't know, Jonathan Mannion, Sandringham Wealth CEO, financial advisor to the stars. Isn't that how we introduce you?
I like that. I like it a lot. Sorry, that's better.
Yeah.
So there was a couple of really interesting pieces in there. For me, it's the legislative piece at the moment that sort of keep me awake at night. And it's not the current legislation, how advice given in the past and going forward is going to be judged. So what we started to see is a couple of cases where they will look at a piece of advice from up to 10 or 12 years ago. 12 is the longest that I've heard, and judge it on current legislation. So the advice was given consistent with the legislation at the time. We moved forward 12 years, and it's now judged against legislation that didn't even exist. I guess on a personal note, from my practice, that risk is limited. Sort of going backwards. But going forwards, I guess my concern is the precedent's been set that they can now look back. So the advice that I'm giving now and the work that I'm doing now is potentially going to be tested in a decade's time against legislation that doesn't yet exist.
Right.
I don't really have a solution for that one. But you said what's keeping me awake, that's it.
Special. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's actually, I mean, apart from sort of everything being absolutely sort of rock solid and, you know, I's dotted and T's crossed, there doesn't seem to be an enormous amount that I can do. I think the whole industry is sort of grappling with that. And then the legislation in the sort of the back end of the Royal Commission is really starting to, we're starting to see the impacts now. And there is obviously a big cost associated with the Royal Commission, be it sort of 2 or 3 years ago, and that's just rolling out now. There's a lot more compliance focused, there's a lot more costs. And even simple things like PI cover is so much more difficult to get because basically a lot of the insurers have removed themselves from the market. So we've now got four choices. Premiums have gone up, and it's one of the areas, that I'm sort of looking at going from a cost structure point of view. Costs are rising, and there's not any sort of way to, there's not a lot of competition in the market. There's, a lot of it's regulatory cost. So it's just trying to find, simpler, still compliant, but shorter, sharper ways to get the same things done more cost effectively. Because if you don't, then it's now, just increasing prices or reducing profit. So, I guess you wear some of that personally, and some of it's got to be passed on if you can't find the efficiencies.
Yeah. Okay, great. And what do you? I guess I think you've shared with us a little bit, but yeah, is there anything else you've got in mind that you think you can do to try and, I guess, counteract this stuff for your, I guess, either for you as a profession, but even separately, I guess, as well for your client base as well?
Yeah, some of it's actually starting to, the legislation is actually starting to catch up with the technology, because obviously tech moves so much more quickly. And we're starting to see some stuff where the two, the regulators are looking at it going, oh, there's some great tech out there. Let's sort of open the door and see where that goes. So, in the past, everything had to be formally written up in black and white. And it's similar to the legal profession. Somebody comes up with the recommendations, it gets pushed out to a paralegal or a paraplanner, and then it gets written up, formalized, and comes back. But I've just started actually using, for the simpler stuff, just using video. So a similar setup to this. And instead of having, it's the same amount of time, there's the same amount of work that goes into it, but we cut out one step and potentially sort of a week odd sort of circuit to get back to me and out to the client.
Yeah.
But if we go back sort of 4 or 5 years, that option just wasn't there, because everybody looked at video and went, what is that? And now with COVID having come through and accelerated the trend, everybody's looking at it going, we already use video anyway. What is the difference in a written and a written document and a video? So that's pretty good in terms of, a couple of the efficiencies that are potentially coming out. And then the last question around perspective and, sectors most at risk. To Daniel's point about the rates and the like, that's actually where I see the biggest risk is businesses that are highly leveraged, or not even necessarily highly leveraged, but highly rate sensitive. Because inflation is probably going to be our biggest sort of short to medium term risk. Some of it will be domestic, but I think the bigger one that I'm watching actually is sort of the imported inflation, predominantly from the US, where the taps are open, and despite the fact that you think they're fully open, they just keep on opening them more and more and more. And we're starting to see, James, you mentioned the economy's running really hot. They certainly are, but the stimulus is still pushing through. And at some point that inflation comes through, and it is transferred, even a simpler mechanism as the bank's funding pool is, the big chunk of it sits in the US, and if their rates go, so do the banks, and it just, it comes through. So actually, in terms of a way to mitigate risk, I'm actually talking to clients. It's probably contrary to the normal sort of thinking around when rates are low, borrow up to your eyeballs. I'm actually looking at it as a great opportunity to deleverage, to cut that risk, because we, the RBA doesn't have an enormous amount of place to go. So I think that's certainly a big risk, and in terms of mitigating it, it's probably looking at deleveraging now, or having a facility to deleverage or cope with in future.
Oh, that's a fascinating insight. I could sarcastically say, it's all right, Jono, we can just consult the Turkish Prime Minister. He's the master of managing an inflated economy, isn't he? Like, he doesn't even follow economic principles. That's his approach.
The bloke who runs Zimbabwe actually set the record, as far as I know. He literally knocked 6 zeros off and said, "Job done, guys." And no, for sure, he actually the formal press release was 0 to hero, and it had him on the front knocking 6 zeros off the Zim dollar.
Oh, hilarious! Oh, no, look, thank you, John. That was as expected, fascinating perspective. I was even just going to say, Dino, you're the reformed economist. What do you make of that, mate?
I haven't lived through 1987 at AMP and listened to what Jonathan was saying. I'm thinking interest rates are going to come into play a lot sooner than we think. And as Jonathan says, I get the impression that there's going to be some sort of blip sometime in the next 6 to 12 months where maybe into the new year 2022 that you might see. You'll start here. I think you're starting to hear a lot of noise coming from America, from Europe, about interest rates are going to rise to prepare the groundwork for an interest rate rise. And when it finally does happen, that's going to be the first impact of what we'll see about when interest rates come and what governments do as far as servicing their debt. That's going to be the key to it, because 87 was a big day when that crashed on the Tuesday and went down 25%. I know I'm showing my age. GFC was 4 or 5 years in the making. This is going to happen at some point in time. Equity and bonds have to come back into some sort of kilter. At the moment, it's like this. It's going to start to come back. When it starts to come back, that's when it's all going to go. And as Jonathan says, companies deleveraging, households deleveraging, governments deleveraging by trying to reduce their exposure to their debt. They could find themselves without any action 2 or 3 years in a worse situation than they could be now. So yeah, it's from an economist's point of view, I'm sort of sitting here very, very nervous at the moment. I'm nervous about the situation, but hey, I'm an economist. That's what I do.
No, they're really, really good insight. And I mean, I could be sarcastic and say you've been beating me around the head with that personally for about 6 years anyway. So, well, look, I'll move on because we'll run short of time. But so, last but by no means least, I'll introduce you to Dave, the CEO of Cinch. And so, for those that may not be familiar with Dave, Dave is the CEO of Cinch Finance, which is a not-for-profit finance and outsourced accounting specialist. I probably didn't explain it properly, Dave, so I'll hand it over to you. We are hoping to see Craig from Centennial Coal, but I'm not sure if he's going to make it. So we'll go on, Dave. And so, Dave, from your perspective, hopefully I've introduced you correctly, but stop me if I haven't. What's making you lose sleep at night, mate?
Well, thanks. We're not actually a not-for-profit, but we work with not-for-profits. Yeah. So we're a commercial business. We try and make money like the rest of us. What's keeping me awake? I talked a bit about it when Rupert and you presented it about a month ago. It was around the cybersecurity. That was one of the big things at the time for us. We haven't had any breaches, but a lot of people in our sector do, and they have lots of sensitive data. And you saw I posted in the chat a link to Uniting Care Queensland had a breach in their security, and they were actually held to ransom earlier this month. So affected them massively. So what we're doing about it, I've got a guy and we're looking at it. We're putting security on our personal mobile phones, and it's managed 24/7. And it's coming from the US. There's the infrastructure and technologies from the US based here. So it's a good price point for small business as well.
You told us the name of the product last time, David. Just remind us again and I'll post it.
Yeah, I am going through a guy called Cyber Ninja. It's his name, Paul Hankin. and I can send you the details, because he does free, he'll assess you and give you a report on areas. He did tell me that he had a list of like 4,000 Australian businesses that he emailed and said, there's a breach in your security, and they sort of, are about to call the federal police, saying there's this guy trying to hack me, but he was just trying to, do a wrong marketing campaign. But so once I've got that sorted, the reason why I want to get my security and cyber up to scratch is we're doing benchmarking. We're doing a lot of benchmarking. We've done some for the early childhood intervention. So we'll be collecting a lot of data from organisations, and I want to give them assurance that we've got top-notch sort of security in all the software we're using. So that's part of the reason. But the other risk that we're looking at is something that Daniel said, is around the staffing. We've got the right staff in at the moment, but when you couple that with growth plans, and the thing that would keep me up is how to manage that growth with getting the right staff. And we're probably going to go to another platform for systems as well. So you get to a point and you go, okay, I've sort of outgrown that. Let's go to the next level type of system. So it's just managing that. So we're just doing investigations. The other thing that we're talking about a lot, how we're bringing people back to our environment and keeping that flexibility, because a lot of our staff want to work from home. But I've actually taken a bit of advantage, and I've employed someone out of Sydney and employed someone out of Central Coast. So I've started to think, similar to what Jonathan, you were talking about with using video, and the nature of how we're doing business is a lot less travel, and our model is virtual. So we don't necessarily need to be on site, in an organisation. We do like to have that client contact and see people and build those relationships. But I can find skilled labour, in various areas, but we still have to have a balance to say, well, let's all meet at some point. But just sort of taking advantage of tapping into some of that skilled labour that was on the market. It's probably less on the market at the moment. Sorry. The thing that we're having lots of conversations with is around the culture, and the psychological safety is big at the moment. And I'm working with an organisation that goes in, they've got some software, and we bring clarity and awareness to the client. So they're looking at, obviously we're talking about mental health and well-being, and people are running leadership and training courses. Now, what this does is bring clarity to different levels in your organisation as to where. There's 25 questions, but it talks about, there's analysis to say where should we spend this training, and what topic should we be spending it on, and at what level. So it's really, really granular, a lot of clarity, and you can design specific leadership programs around that, because it might identify that there's an issue with leadership communication in one area, might be health and safety in another. It might be some sort of communication, but at different levels and different geographical locations. So that's important for us, because what we do is go in, look at an organisation, do a business health check or something like that, look at some financial levers that they can pull to improve their business and help more people. But what happens is, if those people in the organisation don't change and go through a process to say, yeah, I'll change my habits, it's not an easy thing to do. But if they don't do that, then nothing's going to happen. If they don't have a safe environment to voice their opinion, which is all about the psychological safety, well, nothing's going to happen. So we're trying to tackle that in parallel with our sort of financial modelling and business health checks and the recommendations we do there. What I'm finding in the environment that we work in, so across the disability sector, and that is huge. You're talking community housing groups, you're talking disability providers, health, aged care. They're the main ones that we sort of dabble in. NDIS is our main specific one. And what I'm seeing in that space is culture, like poor culture, and that poor psychological safety environments, are meaning that some of these organisations are making some poor informed decisions. So as an example, I'm a phone call away from calling Daniel and saying, mate, there's this organisation, it's just performing poorly, yeah, on the phone. But part of it is that they're just not listening, and they're thinking we've been right for so many years. And I'm talking a decent size, 15 mil turnover organisation, you know, helping, you know, maybe 600-700 people, and they're just letting it get to a point where people in that organisation don't feel safe to say something, you know, that could make a difference. And then there's just poor culture, you know, poor decision making. So also in the disability space, we've done some benchmark reports. So, well, I'm not saying that the poor performance is not from demand. The demand through COVID is still there. It doesn't go away. And what we found, we did a survey for disability providers from 0 to 6 years old, providing services to kids that are 0 to 6. And every one of those providers said there's an 8-week plus wait list for kids. And the average number on their wait list was 53 kids. And that was in June 2020 last year. Spoke to them earlier this year in the last month or so. The areas where, so COVID hit and people have moved out of, you know, Sydney, Melbourne into more regional areas. So what's happened with some of these providers is they haven't had the infrastructure to support that growth. And it's coming from two levels. Families are moving in, so there's more kids with disability in the rural areas. You know, I'm talking 3 or 4 hours out of a big city. They don't have the infrastructure. Housing is short. Rents are high, so they can't attract allied health professionals. So there's a workforce issue in those areas as well. So that's why their wait lists are getting so big. So it's coming from two angles. On the flip side, in the community housing sector, and it'd be interesting to see if anyone's got any stats at some point on the level of borrowing from, you know, community housing, commercial, and the residential. But the community housing sector are actually looking at, they're pumping money into the economy at the moment because there's such a shortage in housing. Disability, aged care, there's just a huge shortage of housing. So that would obviously have some impact on our economy if inflation starts to rise, and also interest rates. But look, I don't know, it all keeps me up at night because we just want to help more people, but we just can't do everything. So our main aim to combat all of that is just to get more awareness out there in the community.
Yeah, great. No, well, look, thank you, David. Again, as always, great insights. And I think, yeah, there's so many of those narratives, I think, you know, we see play out with our disability customers in that space, but even more personally with a couple of the families that I've worked with in regional areas. And we're not talking about regional, we're talking about like East Maitland and places like that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, issues around getting consistent access to supports, absolutely. That parallels what we're hearing. Just a quick one, and we wanted to go for a couple of minutes of open discussion to finish off. So Rupert's with us from Singapore, but he's in the car, so he can't really talk, but a fantastic debrief from him. So Rupert said, really interesting discussion, 2 cents from Singapore in yet another half lockdown. Cyber keeps me awake at night personally as we've got a SaaS offering. More broadly...
sorry, James, I can't actually, we just arrived. I'm taking my son for a haircut. If you actually want to see a demonstration of what, I don't know how many of you have been to Singapore, but we're in the Orchard area and it's like a ghost town. So it's really kind of strange. So following up on the comment, it's the retailers here are calling it a bit of they're saying it's like the zombie lockdown, because basically people have been told you can't go out in groups of more than 2 and try not to go out at all if you possibly can. So most people are heeding that, which means that you've got all these shops that are open, but no one's in them. So I'm in one of the busiest sort of malls in Orchard Road, and it's there's probably 5-6 people on this one floor. So yeah, it's pretty weird, and that's going to hurt. There's no way that's not going to hurt over time.
Can you give us a quick flick on your video feed so we can see Rupert and give us a pan around?
Sorry?
Can you flick your video feed on and give us a quick pan around so we can see?
Yeah, sure. Hang on. I'll try that.
Yeah, no worries. Because, you know, live and direct. Oh, nice. Sweet. I'm surprised you didn't go for a jiu-jitsu themed mask.
So yeah, it's kind of there's no one anywhere really. Even Toys R Us is kind of shut. But on the subject of jiu-jitsu, because they don't want, the government doesn't want to subsidize people anymore. They're making things open so that in theory we're allowed to go to jiu-jitsu, but we have to wear masks and there's a limit on the class size. So that means that the people like that are just running on a bare bones skeleton because they can't get the numbers in that they normally would. But yeah, this is I don't know how many of you know Singapore well, but this is the Forum Mall, which is like right next to sort of on the middle of Orchard Road. But it's just absolute kind of ghost town. So it's like, I don't know, 5, 6 of us here at the moment.
Bizarre, mate. Bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
weird.
So did you want to talk us, because we're just about out of time, but did you want to talk us through those last couple of points as well?
No. I guess it'd be useful just to open the floor up to others. And also, I've lost my son, which is he's in a shop there. But yeah, it'd be I'm happy to listen to others.
Yeah. No. Well, thanks for making the effort to join us, mate. But yeah, all we can say is the grant are getting made up in various states of Australia, ready for imminent arrival. Yeah, I've got on you head off. You lead it on.
So, and it relates to geography, various geographies, and that's been a bit of a theme, particularly about how people are moving around and accessing services and the flights from the major cities out to regional locations. And I can personally say, for someone who lives in Port Macquarie, that town has not stopped being full of people for about the last 8 months. It is absolutely loved to death and full to the brim. So from someone that lives in a beachside suburb right now, there's a lot of people in town, and it's been that way for a long time. But the thing that I have noticed, and my question, Daniel, relates to insolvencies in terms of geographies, because what I've noticed in Port Macquarie was that, yes, all the businesses got their way through COVID, and I'm talking retail and hospitality and all of those sorts of things, and then along came floods. And so in our area, what's happened was it was like a compounding effect. So you might have managed to inch your way through COVID and keep your nose above the water. One more natural disaster hit and we're out. And is that a theme that you're seeing in insolvencies or think that you might see? Because we're now seeing a lot of previously open businesses now closed post the flooding event.
Sure. I think that there's a lot of, it's a matter of time, I guess, to see that. There's usually a pretty big time lag in decision making in general terms that affects insolvency, because the issues take a while to manifest. Insolvency procedures are obviously usually a point of last resort for people. So in the event, say that there's an event, there's a lot of goodwill. Say, for example, if there was a business that was badly affected by bushfires that had a large bank debt, the banks are out there doing the right thing and supporting and providing, holidays from payments, extending terms, allowing refinances. So there's options out there and goodwill to support those. It's just a matter of time, I guess, before we see all of those that start to manifest. I think that for some businesses, though, some businesses and some owners just say, look, this is too hard, particularly in the SME space. It's just too hard, and they decide to walk away. But those ones I probably see are in the minority. So you don't really see a large spike out of that. But it'll be interesting to see geographically. I think that the data is all artificially skewed from the stimulus measures, to be honest. And even the businesses that were struggling, say, from the bushfires, then they would have probably qualified for JobKeeper and those sorts of things as well. That keeps the staff employed, but what meaningful employment or meaningful service are they providing? So I think that's the time factor. It'd be interesting where lodgement deadlines come up, and I think a lot of the business will be driven by the ATO. Because they've been the nice guy, they've done It's one hand of the government probably talking to the other, but making sure that they're not saying we've got a big problem here. They've just released their annual report, and the statistics are pretty big in the amount of growth in debt. I think it grew from 45 billion to I think 53 billion in book debt in 1 year, which is a huge increase, and they're down about 1.3 billion in tax revenue from last year. So that's chickens are going to come home to roost soon, I think. And that'll be driven by what the ATO does and how heavy-handed they get if they do.
And it's probably going to, and that's, thank you for that. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, I think, if we're all sitting here having this conversation in 12 months' time, because you would expect that the economy will settle to a degree, I guess, and I'm no economist, so Dean and Jono, I'll leave that one with you guys because you're the experts. But from my perspective, like in my township, we're flooded with money from tourist dollars. So that's propping up the cafes and the restaurants and all of those, you know, all of that sort of hospitality kind of space. But as things settle and then the world sort of, you know, has some normality back, what's going to happen with those dollars and where are they flowing to and from? So I guess it's a bit of a lag to see the outcomes.
Yeah, great. Well, so look, was there any, we've got a couple of minutes left. Was there anyone else that wanted to throw anything out there into the universe or ask a question or provide an opinion, do a dance? We can record to TikTok, whatever suits.
You don't want to see me dance, but I was having a chat to...
I just had a mental image there, Jonathan. It was fantastic.
I was having a chat to an HR consultant. She does some headhunting and all sorts of sort of HR related stuff. But what she was saying around the COVID stuff, particularly for smaller businesses, she said what she's seeing is an absolute minefield is that somebody has been working from home or comes into the office, has an absolute breakdown, and then the business owner is sitting there going, well, now what the hell do I do? I haven't got the skill set. I don't know whether I should go and say, are you okay? And then what do I do? So one of the things that she's implementing for her clients, and you know, I'll see if I can get details of anyone's interested for the smaller businesses around, is basically outsourcing the service. And she said basically she is now trained all of her clients to say, right, if something like that happens, if you don't think that you've got the skill set, she said basically I've trained them to make them a cup of tea, put them in an office, put them on the phone to the specialists. And she said you can outsource that stuff because the people in your business still need the support and you just can't do it. And don't try and wade into those sort of areas if you're not comfortable. So I thought it was a really interesting sort of variation on that theme of sort of looking after people with all of the, I guess, the stress and strain.
Right. And segue to Chris.
That's really good from a workers' comp claim perspective, if I can suggest. I actually had a question about for Jonathan, more around where he sees that, like, is Bitcoin and those sort of markets a disruptor? And you'll have to excuse my ignorance. I have been told on a number of occasions I am on the wrong side of 40 to understand and be able to invest accurately in it.
Me too.
so look, I'm not going to lie, I don't get it. But is it something we should be making ourselves more aware of? Is it something that you see as is going to artificially prop things up for a lot longer than what it should be? Is it just going to pop like a giant balloon and the world falls apart, or is it going to be the way forward?
It's really interesting, actually. I was listening to an economics podcast this morning, and what they were saying is that a lot of the inflation, the fact that particularly the US has turned the taps on, has actually allowed Bitcoin to go. So people are looking at it as a way, sort of as a proxy for gold or an alternative to gold and the like. And if the economy had been sort of more tightly managed, or if it was less loose, I don't know what the correct term is for that, but if it was a little bit more sort of, if it was a bit tighter, the likes of Bitcoin wouldn't happen. I think probably, I don't have any crypto. I think you could flip a coin as to whether it's up, down or sideways. I think the blockchain that sits underneath it sort of the foundation if it's going to have a longer term impact. But I think probably the crypto stuff, the Chinese are already experimenting with the EUN. So I think we might see a bit more of the governments try and sort of take the wind out of the sails. But it's not something that I'm sort of looking at too closely. I think there's the technology's got the ability to change what things look like in future. But I don't really understand, apart from the speculation side of things, what it's going to do.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, it's that we all like to laugh about that, because the bit that gets me with Bitcoin is, our running joke is financial advice from rugby league players. And because we work with a lot of coal miners, the moment I walk into an underground coal mine and the bloke who drives the underground longwall starts giving me financial advice, and it's usually about Bitcoin, usually when I'm the opposite way. So, but
we had a bloke, and he doesn't work. His partner does. He said to her, listen, get the business to lend me 20 grand. And for whatever reason, she said, sure, that sounds like a good idea. So he bought Dogecoin right in the middle of, all of the tweets about how good he was. And he turned his 20 into 250, had the good fortune to cash out. And, he's laughing now.
Yeah. Well, look at that.
Just got to be lucky, that's all.
It does. Look, we've just about hit time, and we've had a couple of people that have had to bail anyway. So, was there any final comments from anyone? And other than that, we'll call it a wrap. Just for next month, what we're hoping to do is pose some really big, deep philosophical questions, which hopefully Rupert can still hear us. We think are particularly relevant for our Southeast Asian neighbours. One of our colleagues, Ali, and also a friend and colleague, Theo, who's a general counsel in-house for a tech company, we thought the idea would be good to pose the question, what is the priority in the, let's call it the new COVID era? Is it public safety? Does it trump personal privacy, or does personal privacy trump public safety? In terms of whether it's apps, whether it's been forced to go and get COVID jabs, all sorts of things like that. What's the actual priority there? So we understand that there may be times when our liberties have to be slightly impinged upon for a greater purpose. Sorry, Larry, I'm coming closer now. Is that better? But the question that we want to debate is which is the priority? Is it public safety, and does that trump privacy, or does privacy in terms of medical record privacy and personal privacy, is that paramount? And we wanted to debate that via a panel and look at what are some of the practical ways we could address that within our own businesses. So if that interests you, or any of your colleagues in your businesses or other businesses around you would like to join us for that fantastic intellectual debate, as usual, then feel free to join us. But look, thank you to all our presenters, Jono, Dave, who's not here, Kath, Daniel, and the Rapsy Griffiths guys. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Yeah. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. And we'll post the recording and any of the supporting resources to the group. See ya. See ya. Bye.